In the first part of understanding Hadrian's Wall, Mystery What Mystery, some of the various characters, agencies, resources and circumstances that led Hadrian to order the building of the wall were discussed. It concluded by listing 8 important academic ideas that underlie our conventional view of the wall, including 5 variations in design and layout, previously known as decisions, which form the basis of our mystery. Why did this design change? Or more precisely, what motivated or drove these changes? There was a change in the thickness of the wall, a decision to build the western third in turf, the addition of forts and a large earthwork known as the Vallum at the rear. High-level academic work on the wall consists in trying to reconcile these changes with the limited archaeological relationships that exist. It is important to stress the wall is an imaginary monument with its own visual tradition, and like most of Roman culture, it is envisaged as a great achievement, a typical bit of can-do Roman military engineering. The problem is that the archaeology is a disorganized mess and does not tell a consistent story when approached from the perspective of a carefully executed Roman plan. So in part 2 of understanding Hadrian's Wall, we're going to look at the evidence for just 3 aspects of this puzzle: the turf wall, the vallum, but we're going to start by looking at the space between the wall and the ditch, known as the berm. In front of the wall is a ditch, with the majority of the spoil forming a bank on the north side. Between the south edge of the ditch and the wall is a gap of 20 feet or more, known as the berm. Traditionally, this has been explained as a requirement of structural stability. It prevented the wall from subsiding into the ditch. However, this is not an argument that an engineer, modern or Roman, would accept or recognize, and certainly should not detain an archaeologist who digs holes for a living. The space is way in excess of anything required for foundation design. You could have pushed the wall over, and it would not have fallen into the ditch. Excavations in the east, where the wall is buried beneath the urban sprawl of Tyneside, revealed that the berm was not a blank space, as had been assumed. The space between the wall and the ditch was occupied by large post pits, mostly forming 3 lines. This is how an archaeologist with an interest in timber structures, particularly post holes, became embroiled in the archaeology of the wall. It was over a decade ago, while working for Tyne and Wear Museums, that these archaeological features came to my attention. My initial impression was that these were the remains of scaffolding, demonstrating an important concept in structural archaeology: always assume you are wrong. The blockers features on the right, nearest the fort at Wall's End, were of particular interest. They had a measured layout and a 60-degree geometry, which was clearly the remains of an engineered structure. As so often happens, once these features had been noted, they turned up elsewhere. These lines of post pits, laid out between the wall and the ditch, were found at 3 sites between Newcastle and Wall's End. However, most important evidence turned up in Throckley, at the far eastern edge of the urban sprawl, where the wall finally emerges into the countryside. As discussed in part 1, Hadrian's Wall was mostly destroyed by an 18th century road that used it as a foundation. However, the opportunity to examine this area arose when a 2-kilometre service trench was dug along this road. Frankly, a lot of time and other people's money is wasted looking down this type of trench. But this exercise turned up some crucial evidence, because the trench was cut between the wall and the ditch along the berm. The post pits were clearly visible in the sides of the trench, demonstrating that they were also present with the broad wall west of Newcastle, that they were continuous and evenly spaced. Not only were they of similar size, but also of similar depth, an important feature of any foundation and indicative of an engineered structure. What was crucial was the observation that where the ditch changes direction, this is also true of the post pits, demonstrating that the 2 features are related. Importantly, the ditch is known to be one of the earliest aspects of the wall. The archaeological sections of these features show that each of the post pits once housed two posts that had been removed or robbed. Their regular layout and depth indicate a carefully planned structure. Unusually, and unlike buildings, it is the spaces between the posts that give this design its utility. They facilitate the construction of a rampart comprising horizontal timbers around and presumably hiding the more vulnerable vertical components. The layout facilitates a regular box-shaped structure using layers set at 90 degrees to each other. Such a structure could be strengthened by including bracing layers at 60 degrees. The measured layout evident in the plan suggested a structure built around a standard-sized box, perhaps 12 Roman feet, something that could be created and moved by a two-man team. The advantage of a double post pit is that they are easily dug using standard Roman entrenching tool that was part axe, part pickaxe, and was routinely carried by legionaries. The two posts placed in each pit could be locked together by placing horizontal timbers built up in layers, held in place by the weight of the structure above. In addition, the natural taper and the stubs of branches make it difficult to dislodge individual pieces. Modelling a structure using posts in this configuration gives rise to a rampart comprising mainly horizontal timbers. While there was probably a standard way of building it, it is a very flexible concept. It should be possible to build quite a regular structure using timbers at 90 degrees and parallel to the front with an occasional bracing layers at 60 degrees. Equally, it is possible to create a much more irregular structure mainly composed of timbers at 90 degrees and 60 degrees to the front. It could produce the very regular structures illustrated in Roman art, but this would depend on the nature of the timber and the amount of carpentry involved. As a model, it produces a strong and credible rampart with a broad fighting platform that could be constructed from an abundant local resource. Initial modelling of the timber required suggests that even at 15% woodland cover, the necessary wood could be found to build the rampart within 1,000 metres of the wall. This decreases to 150 metres in wooded areas. The existence of the berm and its post holes immediately behind the ditch and in front of the wall has important implications for the construction sequence of the wall itself. An initial clearance of all the available timber is followed by the construction of a wooden rampart. In front of this, a ditch is dug with the earth predominantly thrown to the north, forming a bank, with a small amount burying the foot of the rampart on its south side. The stone wall is then built behind this protective barrier, which then can be recycled into other aspects of the project. I have built CAD models of this type of structure using a range of tapering bolts. Each timber has to be positioned individually, and frankly, it would be quicker to build one at full size. This leads us back to the tricky problem of visualizing the past and the difference between diagrams and pictures. However, in this case, we can appeal to higher authorities in the form of Roman art. Trajan celebrated his victory in the Dacian War by building a column in Rome with a continuous frieze depicting the war at 1/3 scale using marble figures. I have highlighted several illustrations of structures composed of alternate layers of horizontal timbers. They all appear very neatly constructed, so to what extent we are looking at an artistic convention or an attempt at realistic representation is impossible to say. The Gallic Wars start with the incursion of the Helvetii from Switzerland, who decided that they were so sick of living next to the Germans that they were all going to move en masse and live in the south of France. Unfortunately, this took them through Roman-controlled territory, and Caesar, refusing their permission, built 19 miles of fortifications along the south bank of the Rhone, 16 feet high, with additional forts in very short order. This forced the Helvetii to cross into Gaul further north. This is our best, if not only precedent, for building a large-scale linear barrier before the time of Hadrian. Throughout this presentation, Roman sources have been quoted fairly liberally. For example, the Helvetii are numbered at 368,000 by Caesar. All we can say about these figures is that they were considered credible at the time. Julius Caesar mentions the construction of timber ramparts over 40 times in his military writing, and at times describes additional towers, galleries, and deck added to ramparts, as well as their importance as a platform for artillery and projectile weapons. The whole campaign culminates in one of the most extraordinary battles in history, at the Gaulish hill fort of Alesia. The Romans had besieged the forces of Vercingetorix, surrounding the Gauls with a series of ramparts and ditches to prevent their escape. Subsequently, to prevent his own forces from attack by a second relieving Gaulish army, Caesar builds a second set of ramparts to defend his own forces. There then follows a remarkable engagement, with the Roman forces fighting off Gauls on both sides from within a donut of defensive ramparts and ditches. Rather against the odds, they won, and Vercingetorix was forced to surrender. The towers in the background of this famous picture presumably represent the Roman siege works. There is a particular passage in Caesar's account of the battle that has a particular bearing on the modern narrative of Roman Britain. To strengthen his position, he has his men dig trenches 5 foot deep, some distance from the front of his fortification, and fill them with sharpened branches and irregular wood to form an entanglement. These are a series of 5 foot deep trenches, backfilled to prevent the timbers being uprooted. This uses up irregular timbers and branches not suitable for rampart building. Caesar says his soldiers call these kippies, which is a marker post, possibly for a grave. So this is the author sharing some soldiery black humour. He also mentions lilia, conical shaped holes, like the flower, the size of a foot, containing a sharpened stake, a simple but effective trap to impale the unwary. He also mentions iron hooks, known as spurs, which presumably act something like caltrops but for human beings. The importance of these obstacles to Caesar's narrative becomes apparent when, in the final battle, the Gauls attack at night, and these obstacles are very effective in helping delay and break up the assault. The importance of these obstacles to Roman archaeology, and the wall in particular, is that they are the only Latin reference to holes in the ground made by the army. So it was only natural that they should be found in Britain. Excavating Latin gets you a triple word score. The regular post pits in front of the wall have been therefore interpreted as kippy pits, despite kippy being irregular pieces of wood buried in trenches. Similarly, a block of large double post holes, the size of small baths, found further north in Scotland, were described as lilia, presumably as a defence against the enemies in oversized clown shoes. The idea that regular and widely spaced post pits could serve the same function as a series of trenches also requires the existence of asymmetrical spiky trees with regular 20 to 30 centimetre diameter trunks, which is very unlikely. All this to produce a line of spiky obstacles easily removed and of no practical value. For example, how would this be maintained? What would stop the berm degenerating into an overgrown area like a hedge? The idea that these features are obstacles is no more sustainable than the argument about structural stability. Turning to another aspect of the early wall, the section to the west of the fort at Bird Oswald is known as the turf wall. We shall take as our text a recently completed report compiled for English Heritage in around 2000. At some subsequent stage, all of the wall was completed in stone, but for reasons we will explore later, a section of turf wall was left intact. This turf wall at Appletree had originally been excavated in the Victorian period and was re-examined by English Heritage in 1999. At this point, the structure is represented by a low bank with a ditch almost immediately in front of it. Significantly, there is no berm. Immediately to the south is the Vallum. Archaeologically, the turf wall is represented by a peaty deposit, almost 60 centimetres or 2 foot thick, which is a sort of wood ash grey with darker horizontal banding. It is assumed that this is the archaeological remains of a rampart made from turfs, blocks of soil held together by the roots of vegetation, originally 14 foot or 4¼ metres tall. The modern excavation took samples for analysis, but concluded the deposit was indeed the remains of a turf rampart. There the matter might have rested if I had not been asked my advice on building a Roman fort using turf. My initial reaction was that forts should be built from timber, but I was aware of the turf wall, and I had always assumed it to be at least part built from timber. I had considered it part of my initial timber phase, although I had never followed it up, as there are no post holes involved. However, now my curiosity had been aroused, I took a look at the evidence, particularly those more scientific aspects of the report. From this, three anomalies became apparent. Firstly, when I took the raw data from the pollen report and represented it graphically, it told a very different story. While the pollen from below and from the upper layers of the turf wall showed open country dominated by heather and grasses, the material from within the wall itself is dominated by tree and shrub pollen. Shrubs in this context being smaller trees like hazel. This marked domination of woodland species, particularly alder and hazel, as might be expected close to the river, was evident to the specialist, but somehow was overlooked when concluding that this material was derived from turfs. The second problem is the plant remains. Archaeologists routinely collect samples of soil from which carbonized plant remains are extracted by flotation or washing the dirt, as is sometimes known in the US. Also present in significant quantities were the fruiting bodies of fire moss, a species that grows on burnt and rotting wood. These were not what should have been expected from a structure built from blocks of soil held together by the roots of grasses. But there is an equally worrying problem with these samples. When the soils are analysed, they are put through a graded sieve stack to see what size particles they contain. The turf wall deposit contains only a small amount of sand and a little gravel. It is, in short, an organic soil, like peat, not something derived from other soils. Anything derived from local soils should contain a range of mineral particles. In short, soil should contain stones, gravel, sand, etc. As this deposit does not contain any significant mechanical component, it cannot be made from turfs. It is basic soil science. All the evidence points to it being the rotted remains of a timber structure. This is what has always been described in Roman sources. The use of turf, it would appear, is merely a literary tradition, albeit all-pervading. Much as I had expected, this structure was the western extent of an initial timber frontier, with a ditch in front of it. What was novel here is that it had been left to rot in place and had not been replaced in stone. In other words, it would appear that it was in such a poor state it could not be dismantled by the time westward construction had reached Appletree. When the narrow wall was built westward from the fort at Bird Oswald, it follows a new course further north, leaving a length of undisturbed primary rampart. The use of alder and hazel evident in the pollen may have contributed to the demise of the structure, since neither is well suited to outside work compared with something like oak. The turf wall is thus best understood as part of the temporary works necessary for the project. For example, it would be important to divert the river North Tyne in order to build the stone piers necessary to carry the wall across the river. Ordinary timber bridges can make do with piles, but a 10-foot wide wall is an entirely different prospect. On this image from Google Earth, a large and very regular channel diverting the river around the bridge abutment is evident. There is even a hint of a spoil heap. A significant workforce was engaged between Newcastle and the central sector, spread out with a series of forts, bridges and mile castles to build, along with the connecting sections of wall. The construction force and the garrison together would require significantly more accommodation than the final garrison. As a result, a large number of camps would be needed, as the initial efforts would concentrate on the mile castles and turrets. Having a temporary camp every mile would make sense. In most areas, all traces of such flimsy structures have long been removed by ploughing. But in the central sector, there is a few small camps along with a variety of larger establishments. These temporary structures help us to focus on Hadrian's Wall as a construction project. The idea of a temporary timber rampart with a ditch helps explain the existence of the berm and the post pits, and a wall apparently made from turfs. It also explains how the wall was built, emphasizing that it was a response to a real threat. There has always been an internal inconsistency. If the wall was needed as a defence, how did they have the time to build it at their leisure? Now we can see that the building of a temporary wall both acknowledges and mitigates the threat. The Vallum is probably the largest earthwork in Europe, yet it remains, as it was at the turn of the last century, a mystery. In its pristine form, it consisted of a flat-bottomed trench, with its spoil arranged in neatly revetted banks running parallel at some distance away on either side. It was named the Vallum by the Venerable Bede, a local churchman responsible for some of our earliest surviving historical texts. His view was that it was a defensive structure, and hence the name Vallum. I should point out at this point that the Latin word for the type of timber rampart we've been discussing is actually vallum. Venerable Bede is thus an early exponent, if not the originator, of the triple word score for the use of Latin, misapplied and therefore misappropriating the word vallum, removing it, depriving posterity of its use in its appropriate context, such as it turns out, the initial phase of the wall. Although the scholarship is somewhat flabby, the vallum is usually viewed as a boundary, marking the southern edge of a military zone. It is interesting to note that describing this feature as a ditch with banks, or even a bank and ditch, is a poor description, but suits the concept of a boundary better than a trench with spoil heaps. In the history of wall scholarship, it had in the past been regarded as a form of turf wall built by Hadrian, predating the stone wall, which was regarded as a product of the later emperor Severus. In order to unravel this mysterious structure, we're going to look at 16 of its principal characteristics, using, among other things, profiles recorded in the 1890s at the beginnings of systematic archaeology. The profile at Limestone Corner, where it is cut into the bedrock, is best preserved and shows the trench is steep-sided and flat-bottomed, with the spoil stacked neatly in spoil heaps some distance from the trench. The exception is where it crosses the marsh at White Moss. Here there is no trench cut into the ground, but instead an equivalent space is formed by two banks above ground. Another intermittent feature is known as the marginal mound, a small bank on the southern lip, which appears to be the remains of crossings which would have allowed access across the trench to the mile castles or temporary gateways. It seems that at some point these crossings were systematically removed and the spoil spread neatly along the southern lip of the trench. In plan, the vallum is remarkably simplistic, running south of the wall from Newcastle, not Wallsend, to Bowness. It is laid out in straight lengths, following a different course of the wall in the central sector. The corners are notable for being gentle and very deliberate. Where possible, the course of the vallum also avoids steep gradients. At some point, the vallum stops being important. The fort at Crawborough was built over the top of it, and regular holes were dug in the banks, and the crossings were reinstated. The plan is remarkably regular and consistent in its measurements, being 120 feet wide. It is a very unusual and unique structure. No one else has a vallum. But in engineering terms, what is extraordinary is the moving of the spoil. Perhaps 1.5 million cubic meters were moved 30 feet from the trench, instead of just dumping it on the edge on one or even both sides. This is probably the most important point. What is unique about the vallum that it is not a bank and ditch. The solution to this mystery is that the vallum was the foundation trench dug for a road that was never completed. An important point to bear in mind is that a proper Roman road had a hard central carriageway for wheeled vehicles, with the margins on either side for the use of pedestrians and riders, neither of whom benefit from a hard stone surface. We do not have a Roman handbook of road engineering. Our only resource is a poem by Statius in praise of a new road built by the Emperor Domitian. This describes the process of digging a foundation trench, filling it with material, and laying a mortar stone surface with a curve. This is confirmed by the excavations of the actual road, and this is fundamentally how roads are made today. Any hard surface will require a graded foundation, either sunk in a trench or built up on the surface, otherwise known as an agger. The idea of an abandoned road cutting can be shown to fit the evidence better than any concept relating to boundaries. If we look at the 16 characteristics we have just reviewed, the first 7 could be consistent with it being a boundary, or at least don't preclude it. However, problems arise when we look at its steep-sided and flat-bottomed nature. This is not a stable shape and will rapidly deteriorate, and is a waste of time, whereas it is important in a road foundation for it to be as wide as the surface it supports. However, the really inconsistent element is the massive effort required to move perhaps 3 million tons of material and stack it neatly 30 feet away. It is completely unnecessary in some form of boundary, but essential to create a 3-lane road, as the boulder clay is too inconsistent to be used in the construction process. The gentle corners are required for wagons because they have 2 sets of wheels alongside the chassis, which gives them a poor turning circle. Similarly, the moderate gradients are self-explanatory. None of this is relevant to a boundary, but is typical of a road, and a Roman road in particular, which is a perfectly clear precedent in terms of layout and plan. The fact that it is abandoned follows a similar pattern to the scaling back of the project, represented by the adoption of the narrow wall. Finally, there is the strange profile at White Moss, where it crosses a marsh. This can be explained as preparations necessary for laying a wooden or corded road, the only practical solution to create a road in these circumstances. This form of structure is illustrated on Trajan's column. The evidence clearly supports the idea of it being an abandoned cutting for a road, and is not consistent with the literary tradition of it being a boundary, which cannot realistically account for some of the Vallum's most significant and distinctive characteristics. The idea of a grand road running behind Hadrian's stone frontier seems entirely in keeping with the scale of the project. It would, furthermore, seem essential to integrate the series of forts and mile castles. It also implies that the initial scale of the project was larger than previously suspected, and therefore the effects of the dislocations are more serious than it would first appear. A couple of final important points about the Vallum which might easily be overlooked. The rock they are cut through at Limestone Corner is dolerite. It is the hardest rock in Britain, and it has been quite carefully and deliberately cut through as a deep channel. Nearby, the Roman army gave up work on the ditch in front of the wall as being too much like hard work. Another interesting aspect of this cut through the bedrock is that it's almost exactly 14 Roman feet wide, an appropriate width for a road comprising of 2 7-foot lanes. In part 3, we will bring together all these new lines of evidence and see how they impact on the existing narrative with its series of inconsistent decisions, or perhaps how they fit with the more modern concept of dislocations in the construction process put forward by David Breeze. However, it is perhaps demonstrating that Roman building in turf is completely refuted by the scientific evidence that has the most surprising and far-reaching effects on the wider Roman narrative. Thank you for watching part 2 of Understanding Hadrian's Wall, Building a Myth, and look out for part 3, The Hidden Disaster, coming soon.